Well, I'm very, very pleased, extremely honored to welcome our distinguished guest today, Professor Kwame Anthony Appiah. For those of you who may not be aware of who our guest is, just by way of a brief introduction, Professor Appiah is a British-Ghanaian philosopher, cultural theorist, and novelist whose interests include political and moral theory, the philosophy of language and mind, and African intellectual history. Professor Appiah was the Laurance S. Rockefeller University Professor of Philosophy at Princeton before moving to New York University in 2014. He holds an appointment both at the NYU Department of Philosophy and NYU School of Law. I recently, by way of sort of making people aware of this upcoming event, which unfortunately, I do apologize both to yourself, Chris, and to those who were hoping for the live stream. We were having some issues with the setup, so therefore we're recording now. But by way of sort of advertising today's event, I shared the Forbes article, which is a few years old now, and but very tellingly and importantly, you're ranked as number one amongst the 7 most powerful, I think the title was, thinkers today. And someone sort of commented, this is going somewhere, I promise. Someone commented, oh, this article's a bit old. It'd be interesting to see, I think he used the word game. This was on Facebook. He said, it would be interesting to play that game now and see where, this person is ranked. And I said, well, that's a funny game that you want to play. I mean, clearly, Professor Appiah is important, and I can have a bit of a sharp tongue sometimes. I said he's certainly more important than yourself and myself. So, but it's interesting how these things get ranked, and God knows how these things work. But to my mind, certainly your work is extremely important, not least because Professor, you do the incredibly important job. Not least of all from an academic point of view, because very often academics don't do this very well, of making a powerful argument as to why we must think cross-culturally, sort of philosophically, sort of ethnically and so forth. And that you also make the argument very, very profoundly. I'm not going to go on and on about your arguments, because I'd love to hear from yourself, but that this has in some ways always been the case, and to speak of very neat boundaries, whether culturally, whether racially, intellectually, these are very artificial boundaries, and I was hoping, Professor, by way of introduction, if you could please say a little bit about your incredibly rich own background, which, to my mind, in many ways goes into informing your sort of intellectual pursuits and interests.
Yeah, I mean, I think often people in the kind of philosophy I do understate the importance of biography in shaping intellectual lives, and so I think it's important that everybody's coming from somewhere, and one of the reasons why I think it's good to talk to lots of people is because they're all coming from different places. There are different things to learn from the different perspectives. It's like that old story about the blind man and the elephant. Blind men and the elephant. I mean, together they can build a very rich picture, but one by one, it just looks like a wall to the guy who's standing against the side of the elephant, and a snake to the guy who meets the tail. I was lucky to be. I was born in London to a Ghanaian father and an English mother, and then raised in Ghana until I went to school in England, and then sort of back and forth between the two. And then in my late 20s, I moved to the United States. My parents were Christians of different denominations. So I went to church with my mother, and my father went to his church. But I mean, I and my sisters. But we grew up in a multi-religious family because one of my Ghanaian aunts married a Lebanese Sunni Muslim. So we, they came to us for Christmas. We went to them for Eid. And I lived at the town I grew up in, Kumasi in Ghana, the capital of what used to be the Ashanti Kingdom, is a very multifarious place. There are have been people from everywhere for hundreds of years there. And the Muslim community there is ancient, founded originally by Hausa people coming from northern Nigeria who settled in Kumasi, and who kept their connections with northern Nigeria. So they were not kind of migrants who left home behind. They kept the connection between the northern the Emirates and Sultanates of northern Nigeria and Kumasi. So we had a rich brew of people of many religions, many nationalities, because when I was growing up, they were just starting the university in my hometown, the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, which is the second university in Ghana, really. And that had, as science universities do, people from everywhere: Hungarians, Russians, Chinese, Americans, obviously lots of British people because we were a former British colony. So I think it was sort of inevitable growing up both between two families in two countries and in a city that's very cosmopolitan. It would have been very odd not to be at least a little bit curious about people from other places, because I was constantly meeting them. And I think also one thing that happens if you live in families that are cross-cultural and you grow up in them, you do not have the sense of the difficulty of cross-cultural exchange that people have who don't do it until they're older, I think. I mean, it just, everything from knowing that, in Ghana, I can't touch people with my left hand, but in England, it doesn't matter. Well, nobody ever told me that. It's just that if you grow up in a place where it's bad manners to touch someone with your left hand, you don't do it. And then you notice that in other places, nobody cares. Also, I think, we were raised with both my father's language, which is a language called Twi, and with English, which is both my mother's language and the official language of Ghana. And in fact, my father sent us when we were very young, when we were 4 or 5. It was my father's decision. My mother arranged it to learn French, because he said that French was the second language of Africa. There were lots of Africans who spoke French, and there were lots of Africans who spoke English, and we should learn French because the official language of all the countries around us, Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, and Togo, was French, and so we needed to speak French just to speak to our African neighbors. So anyway, with a background like that, it would be odd to be hostile to cross-cultural encounter. And I feel very much that not just my intellectual life, but my sort of aesthetic life has been enriched by the fact that we grew up with both hymns from European traditions, drumming and dancing and singing from my father's tradition, and other traditions from West Africa, and with a knowledge of, obviously, Elvis Presley, the Beatles, as well as in my father's case, Gilbert and Sullivan, whom he loved. But he also loved Kulthum, and we used to listen to her when we were children. We couldn't understand her because we didn't know Arabic, but we liked the way her voice sounded. So I think that's sort of inevitable against that background. And then when you start looking at it as an intellectual matter, as a scholarly matter, it turns out that there's almost nothing that people really care about in the realm of culture that doesn't have borrowings built into it. The people who do philosophy in the tradition that I was trained in think of themselves as sort of going back to the Greeks, but the Greeks thought of themselves as going back, among other things, to the Egyptians, and being in dialogue with the Persians. And the Persians, of course, were in dialogue with the civilizations of Central and South Asia, and so on. And so everything from, it turns out, for example, that some of the best known fairy tales in Grimm's fairy tales collected by the brothers Grimm in Germany. It turns out that they actually have their origin in Sanskrit stories told thousands of years earlier, which traveled slowly through Central Asia and Asia Minor and into Europe. So we've always been borrowing from one another, and the idea that Grimm's fairy tales are kind of pure essence of something German is completely nonsense. They were, of course, important in Germany, but they got to Germany from other places, as well as being partially shaped and invented in Germany. So, and that's true of, I mean, I don't like the idea of the West very much, but when people talk about the West, they mean something that has double roots in Semitic and in Hellenic cultures, and the thing that the Christians call the Bible is in 2 languages, actually in 3 languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, Koine Greek. So people who read it in English or French or German or something may not appreciate that it's the extent to which it is drawing in ways that are deep and important and central to understanding what the texts mean on very different traditions. So I will ramble on about this, but I mean, it just seems to me that that's when you start thinking about what you care about in the realm of high culture. It turns out that you can't have Shakespeare without Danish princes and Roman senators and Jewish merchants in Venice, and Moors like Othello, and so on. So just both from a sort of abstract level, but also from the matter of everyday experience, it just seems to me lives are made richer by these conversations. And there's an epistemic argument, which is just that it's really hard to get to know things. And so adding in the possibility that you'll learn from somebody who's found one of the hard things to know, but isn't from your culture, just enriches the possibilities of getting things right.
Thank you so much for that. When I was reading, I think it was Cosmopolitanism, when it occurred to me, when I was reading some of your descriptions, the Quranic verse came to mind where, from a Muslim point of view, Muslims believe God speaking through the Quran to us, that God says that he created, or she created us in many sort of tongues and colors and tribes so that we may come to know one another. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that one of the translators of the Quran, he's, I believe, translated portions of the Quran. He's also translated, I believe, the Art of War and other texts like that. Thomas Cleary, he said that was, to his mind, as it were, the perfect antidote to racism, the ultimate sort of affront, or but to your point, Professor, and really this is what you're doing with your work, which is why it's so important, it bears repeating, that you're really challenging these a type of rhetoric which is purist and claiming the West as being this sort of perfect thing that, staying within the realm of philosophy, that ancient Greek, I mean, I'm telling you what you already know, of course, but for those who are listening, that ancient Greek philosophy was handed down perfectly and without any alteration, and sort of held briefly by the Arabs. They made no alterations. They were kind of, which is a very interesting discussion in and of itself. The Arabs/Muslims, how they were just these kind of carriers of the tradition and brought it down to the rightful heirs, which are the Westerners today. And you mentioned that you're not a great fan of the notion of the West. I wanted to ask you, related to this notion of the West, if you could unpack that a little bit for us, please. The the issue of positivism, you sort of, I think, analyze it very powerfully and importantly, that in so many ways you make the point that the assumptions that go into a sort of positivistic outlook we take for granted these days, but then you sort of unpack that. What is the history of that? And how is this sort of notion of the West, which then through a sort of colonial lens and project becomes thrust on, you know, the so-called rest of the world. There's the West, which is perfect, and then everything else is just the rest. Could you speak a little bit to those things, please?
So the thing that's interesting about what I was calling positivism in that book, which is a sort of, I take to have at its heart, and this is, as all claims about philosophical traditions, controversial, but I take it to have at its heart something that goes back in sort of explicit articulation to the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume, which is the separation of the world of fact from the world of value. The sense that, and there are good and interesting historical disputes about exactly to what extent Hume was committed to this. So it's often called Humeanism. Whether Hume was a Humean is an interesting scholarly question. But I'm not making the point. This is not a point about Hume. This is a point about a set of ideas that is often ascribed to Hume and that certainly is widely accepted has been widely accepted. And it's just the idea that it's not just the idea that fact and value are separated. It's the idea that fact and value are separated in the way in which belief, which goes with fact, and desire, which goes with value, are, so that values are just a matter of kind of how you feel about things. And that leads pretty quickly to a kind of relativism about values, because people desire different things. That's obvious. Whereas belief seems to be the sort of thing about which relativity doesn't seem to make much sense, because if it's a fact, then either I'm right or you're right. If you believe one thing and I deny it, we can't both be right. These are complicated questions, and I'm not saying that, I'm just pointing to this as a background set of ideas, which then leads people to think that, well, if you're a relativist about values, then you might expect that, yes, desires will be organized by cultures, so that there'll be different desires in different cultures and therefore different values. But there's nothing to learn from one another about that, right? Because you desire this, I desire that. Whereas if I believe this and you believe that, and they're inconsistent with one another, we can't just stop there, because there's the possibility. So the idea is we can learn facts from one another. We can learn facts across cultures, but we can't learn about values. This seems to me wrong. And wrong in a way that was actually nicely articulated by a great English philosopher, John Stuart Mill, when he said that what we should think of other cultures and also different cultures within our own societies as doing is conducting what he called experiments of living. The world is full of groups of people, societies, countries, religious traditions that are exploring collectively ways to be in the world. And it's just a fact that seeing another way of being in the world, you can learn things from the point of view of your way of being in the world, the one you were raised in or the ones you were raised in. You can just see options that they have explored by living them. And what matters in the end about values is, can you live by them? Can a society be, or a group of people live dignified and enriched lives this way? And the only way to find that out is to try. I think that's the sort of experiments of living point. You can't tell whether you can make, say, liberalism work, except by trying to run a liberal society and seeing what happens. And you can't really tell whether Leninism is going to work, except running a Leninist society and seeing what happens. And in advance, I don't think there was any particular reason to think that Stalinism would go quite so badly wrong. It was, to some extent, motivated by the desire to improve the conditions of working and ordinary people. That's a pretty noble desire. It did go wrong, but and we need to analyze and understand why it went wrong. But and we should learn from that. We should learn from that. We have learned. We have learned, for example, that it's that freedom tends to be better for productivity than command and constraint. But that's something that had to be found out, and it wasn't something that could be discovered a priori. And the only way you can find out is by trying it. So people have tried thousands of different kinds of Christian lives. Christianity is a very sectarian tradition. Christians are constantly dividing off from one another. They're all trying lots of different experiments, and people in the United States now, we have this interesting situation where people are moving, whereas in the 1950s in the United States, people characteristically were raised in a religious tradition, married in a religious tradition, and lived their lives in it. Now in the United States, huge numbers of people are raised. First of all, people marry across traditions in a way they didn't in the past. So then there's the question, well, what am I? I had a modest version of this because I was baptized a Methodist, went to my mother's interdenominational church, and was sent to Anglican schools. So I had to decide what kind of Christian I was supposed to be. But now we have
self-identify as Christian, Professor.
I identify myself as post-Christian. I don't think you can understand who I am without knowing that I was raised as a Christian.
Of course.
So I'm Christian in the way that some people are Jewish, as it were. That it's not that they're practicing or exactly believing, but they know they were formed by traditions.
Maybe post-Christian is another sect of Christianity.
I do think that there's something like that is true. There's a nice piece, which I'm sure you know, because you must know him, by, gosh, how embarrassing. I'm going to forget the name of a good friend of mine who teaches philosophy at Columbia, Akil Bilgrami, who has a nice paper called What is a Muslim, yes. In which he says, basically, as it were, post-theistic Muslims are just a kind of Muslim. And I think that's right. I think if you're raised in Islam, the question of what you happen personally to believe is one thing, but the question of whether you're sort of part of a Muslim tradition is another. And I think you can claim to be. I mean, I know that there are, again, in all of these contexts, there are going to be people. Christianity is full of people who say about most of the other Christians, oh, well, they're not really Christian.
Right.
And you know, some people don't think Ismailis are really Muslims, and other people don't think.
And I think this is a problem, to my mind, which your work as such really is getting at, that we need to kind of problematize these sort of hardened identitarian sort of groupings. But sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. I think that's completely right. I mean, and you know, it's a fact about many religious traditions that they're full of people fighting about the boundaries. But that's true about all kinds of identities. You know, nowadays you can have debates about whether people are queer enough to be queer, or African Americans can be thought be told that they're acting white.
That's something I've come across in a South Asian context as well. Other South Asians have called me coconut. Right?
Yes, exactly.
Well, the outside, yes. White on the inside.
Yes, and
I sort of had to think about that. Is it really? It's interesting. It's very, very interesting.
Well, I just think that it's a substitute for actually debating the issues.
Yes.
So now we're fighting about whether you're really this or that, but or whether this idea comes from there or here. But you know, the right question about an idea is it a good idea? Not who.
And does it work for me? Does it work for my context?
Yes, right. Can we put it to use? I mean, in that way, I think of myself as very much a pragmatist in the American philosophical sense, of someone who thinks that what ideas are for doing things with, And the question is, do they work? Do they do for you what you need them to do? And if they don't, throw them away. And if they do, don't care where they come from, and don't think of them as belonging to somebody else, so you have to borrow them and get permission. If an idea is a good idea and it's useful for you, get on with it, use it.
I think historically...
And just want to say one thing about pragmatism, yes, which pragmatism brings out very much, and is that useful is always useful for what? Some things are useful for one purpose and useless for another. There's no point in using a cooking pot to try and write an essay. So ideas. The right question about an idea is it useful? But that question is always a contextual question. Is it, as you said, is it useful for me? Is it useful for us? And that's a really crucial point. So when other people are doing experiments of living, one of the things you can see sometimes is that's useful for them, but we're not going to be able to, starting from where we are, we're not going to be able to do that. We're not going to be able to do it that way. But it's working fine over there. And then maybe they'll find eventually that it isn't working so well for them, so they'll move on. And one of the points you made earlier about the sort of idea of the West as this pristine, unchanging thing is a tendency of mind that is in all traditions, I think.
True.
Which is to lose track of the ways in which it doesn't matter what it is, Englishness, being Christian, being Jewish, being Muslim. These are things that change over time, and of course there are always the Salafis who want to say, oh, let's go back to the way things were at the beginning. Or we should always have been doing things the way they were done at the beginning. But if you had done things always the way they were done at the beginning, Islam would not exist anymore. Islam has like every decent human tradition and institution, it's evolved, it's developed. People's understandings of things have changed and perhaps deepened.
And also our conception of how supposedly things were done at the beginning. Well, that's just our conception of it,
right. And there's a lot made up in that, and indeed making a tradition of this sort is in part about telling a story, telling a history, and then one way in which people fight the contests about who's really in is by fighting about what the history really says. What significance should we assign to the fact that the first convert is a woman to Islam? Well, over time, different people have given different significances to that fact. Some people have ignored it entirely. Others have said this suggests that women have a much more central place in Islam than they have had in some, but not all, some Muslim societies, some Islamic societies. So
I really think it's central, absolutely. Yeah.
And I think the same thing's true about lots of things that are said to be Christian. Again, the church, the formal Catholic Church as it developed in Rome and then in Byzantium, didn't treated the women in Jesus's life very different from the way it thought about the men. Of course, his mother became in both the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox traditions something like a goddess. I mean, that's a thing that Christians don't like you to say, and it's maybe even blasphemous. But the worship of
the worship, isn't she in Orthodoxy?
Yes. So I think, but my point is not. Again, I'm not concerned to say who's right or who's wrong. Just to say that these sorts of debates are part of what it is to be in these traditions. This is true of philosophical traditions. I mean, that's why I could say something about positivism. Somebody else can disagree. Positivism is really a history of debates. It's not really a history of agreements or propositions. And even in Christianity, which has this astonishingly tight focus on creeds, so that the history of early Christianity is a lot of councils of wise men getting together to say what we believe. Even in Christianity, of course, what they settled on is a verbal formula, right? But then we have to decide what it means, and people keep changing their mind about what it means. And so you can settle on a creed, but you haven't really settled on what it means. And that is a long, long evolving process, and it happens in different ways in different places. So the very same words are now enunciated, so Nicene Creed say, are enunciated by lots and lots of people in lots and lots of Christian sects, but they understand them differently.
Of course.
And usually, of course, what they say is, we've got the right understanding. Each of them says, we've got the right understanding. Well, there are some more modest traditions that say, well, you know, we shouldn't be too confident that we've got everything right. But on the whole, a lot of sects break off precisely because they think that the mainstream of whatever they're breaking off from has got something seriously wrong.
Right. You make some very related to some of these things you just mentioned. You have a really powerful sort of turn of phrase, clannishness. I don't have it written out in full, but if I'm remembering correctly, you say clannishness is basic to human psychology.
Absolutely.
And elsewhere, you also mentioned to your sort of later points, some of your later points, that ultimately, if we really think about it, and to even take sort of a look at things through a sort of postmodern lens, that we're all sort of sects or clans of one person, right?
Yes. I mean, in the end, if you insist on kind of correctness about everything, well, there's only one person who agrees with you, and that's you.
Right. And even I don't agree with myself with it.
And then on Monday, we'll be a different sect from the one you are on Tuesday. Again, I think that there's an interesting background error there of thought, which is to think that what holds people together is agreements. But it's not. Every interesting relationship is as much involved with disagreements as it is with agreements. It's the living together, a couple is the living together of two people who are different from one another. Coupling would be really boring if that weren't true. And a family just sitting around the table deciding what movies to see, say, well, there are different points of view on that, and you have to learn how to compromise.
Something so seemingly innocuous or basic, even that can be a lot of,
yes,
it can turn up a lot of, yeah.
And what it reveals is the you know, as I think the sort of the beauty of mankind, and that's of course what's in that passage from the Quran that you quoted, is that we're not the same. And it turns out actually that this is this is a feature that we share with some of our mammalian ancestors. You know, turns out sheep aren't all the same, and horses aren't all the same either. They have characters and personalities, and so do human beings. And those, when they come together to produce cultures and societies, produce very different results. With you know, and again, those different results are part of what is the beauty of our kind, is that we can look out from one spot in the human array and see what is being learned in the other spots, what's being practiced and tried in the other spots, and look to see whether there's anything over there that will be useful for these purposes over here. And the history of philosophy, of religion, music, painting, sculpture, poetry is that people find things useful from elsewhere.
And it can also just be humbling, right? Is
yes.
that I don't know everything. Like, what a concept. I don't know everything. My people, they don't know everything. I think it's a deeply humbling. It
yes.
can be deeply humbling.
So one of the sort of through lines of the argument in Cosmopolitanism, the book, is for fallibilism. It's for the recognition of our own fallibility.
Yes.
And that's another thing, as you say, you learn from cross-identitarian communication. You just learn that there are other ways of seeing things, and that should reduce your confidence that you've got everything right. And as I say, I think that the key lesson of Western epistemology, there you are, that's sort of a portentous thing one can say, is that a knowledge is hard.
Mm.
It's really hard to come by the
Mm.
truth. And even though we've developed over the last few centuries these very interesting things called sciences, which seem to have sort of found ways of discovering lots and lots of knowledge at a faster rate than humans have done in the past. There's still, as Newton said he felt like a boy on the sand collecting pebbles while the great ocean of truth lay before him. I think scientists should still feel like that. They should still feel, just in the last year, for example, under the pressure of urgency and in an emergency, we have learned that we didn't understand the human immune system very well.
Mm.
And then a similar thing happened in the period of the AIDS pandemic, that we learned a huge amounts about the immune system. And then coming into this one, we thought, oh, well, we know how the immune system works. Turns out we didn't. Turns out there was lots more still to learn, though we know much, much more than we did, in the AIDS pandemic or 20 years before that. So there's still huge amounts to learn, and we're committed. Now scientific communities are all committed. They should know that they're committed very strongly to things that will turn out to be wrong eventually.
Well, and this raises many things that you've said, raise many important points, and I don't have a defined script per se, but there's some things I do want to touch upon. One of which, and hopefully I'll remember some of the other things, to your point just now, is the sort of Foucauldian notion of power knowledge, that there's this sort of mainstream, and actually it seems it's quite, to use that word again, quite a powerful and problematic notion that science is, kind of with a capital S, and science, the way science works, right, in inverted commas, basically the better idea always wins out. But that's not the history of science. Science is very often, it's not always the better idea. Very often it's the more moneyed idea, it's the more, I don't know, flashy idea, what have you, the more, I think an example that comes to my mind in this regard is the example, the tension between Nikola Tesla and Henry Ford.
Oh, yes.
That's a powerful example. And Nikola Tesla almost gets written out of the history books, right? But now there's kind of an effort to reinstate him in his rightful place. But to just sort of chiming with some of the things you said just now, but also I think I've lost my train of thought now. Sorry, before I interrupted, what were you saying?
Well, I was just going to respond to what you said, which is that the ways in which, again, science is a human institution. Science is, again, we talk about science, but really what we have is a lot of sciences, and they don't have a method. They all have different methods. And somebody can be terrifically good at one or two of them and very bad at the others. And they are shaped, they're human institutions, and they're shaped by the things that shape human institutions. For example, many sciences are extremely expensive. So that means that what you can get money for is going to shape what gets investigated.
Right.
Well, that the connection between what you can get money for and what you can get is complicated, because high energy physics is in the state that it is of advancement that it is because the Defense Department of the United States put a huge amount of money into it because it was interested in the weapons potential of that kind of knowledge. But it turned out that what they were supporting was in fact a deepening understanding that has led us to understand things in remote parts of the universe that have nothing to do with weapons making. Lasers are a great example. So far as we know, there are no natural lasers. So laser light is something we invented. And it was invented with money from the Defense Department because it was thought that it might be a good way of making, but now we use it to shape retinas so that people can see better. Yeah. So you can't tell, just because some money comes from the Defense Department, it doesn't mean it's going to end up doing things that the Defense Department cares about. But that has profoundly shaped, obviously, the history, the investments of states, which are often guided by things like the desire to have great weapons, have played a huge role in the shaping of what science gets funded and therefore what science gets done. Doesn't mean that the content of the science is shaped by the funders. The funders, after all, want to know what the truth is. They don't want you to, at least in the physical sciences, they don't want you to shape the truth in order to achieve some political end. They just want to, the end is making the weapons. And for that, they want the truth.
Sorry to interrupt. I wanted to sort of interject slightly. I was wondering if you could speak to the notion that, as far as I can understand it and remember it, that, let's say, reality with a capital R, problematically, this sort of external thing that we're kind of engaging with, even sort of putting aside traditional metaphysics, like just in a physical sense, the sort of the lens that we train on it very often determines what that reality is going to be saying back to us. So if that is true, what I've just outlined, if that is true, then does that not also mean then that the truth that we hear and sort of register is dependent on our original lenses?
Yes. Look, you can't ask the universe a question without concepts. And I don't think electrons were invented, but the concept of electron was invented. And without it, or without the antecedent concepts that eventually led to the idea of the electron, we couldn't have used electron microscopes. We couldn't have understood electricity in the way we do, and in the way Tesla did, and was able to do all those magnificent pieces of engineering that he did. You can only approach, this is a point that's at least as old as Aristotle, right? That you can only think about the world through concepts, and what concepts you have available set the frame of what questions you can ask, and therefore what answers you can receive. So our questioning of reality of the universe is always done through a frame of concepts, and because different peoples and societies and institutions do it through different concepts, they ask different questions and they get different answers. The answers are sometimes they get answers that are incompatible with one another, but more often they just get different answers. The biochemist gets answers to questions about chemicals in cells, and the physicist gets answers to questions about quarks and atoms, and they don't say very much to one another. And a lot of science is sort of a developing body of concepts with which to investigate things, and the things you investigate are shaped by what the concepts are you have available. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a robust reality out there that's responding, but it does mean that every answer is an answer in our terms. Yes. It can't be anything else. And that means that there's no inevitability, I think, about how the sciences go, because there's no inevitability about what concepts we bring to bear or about what questions we bring to bear. And as I just said, the questions we've brought to bear in the case of the physical sciences have been profoundly shaped by who was willing to pay for them.
Yes.
And that all ought to be completely uncontroversial. Right. I mean, but there are things that, I mean, some people think that what I just said sounds like science bashing, which I don't think it is. And other people think it is
historic fact, right?
It's just, yeah. And then other people think it's too generous to the sciences. That
interesting.
I just said that the universe, as it were, gives back robust responses. And there are people who think that, as it were, the universe is made up, and not just our concepts. I don't think that. I think it makes sense to suppose that this is back to the metaphysics. It makes sense to suppose there's a reality out there, but we have no access to it except through our concepts. So the only reality we have access to is reality filtered through our concepts. And because we could have other concepts than the ones we do, and because we will have other concepts than the ones we do, and because we have had other concepts than the ones we do, different times, the universe will speak to us in a different voice, because it's our voice with which it speaks, because we give the universe, it's only us that puts language on the universe to respond to us. But as I say, that doesn't mean that, this pandemic bug was going to get us whether we had a name for it or not. When the last great pandemic happened, the end of the First World War, people didn't really understand as well as we now do what was happening, and so they couldn't ask questions that if they'd answered them, could have led them to slow the spread of the pandemic more effectively. And we do know more, and so if we had done the things that sensible people had proposed, we could have cut the effects back even further than we have.
Some things that come to mind, again related to some things that you've just mentioned. You mention you have this notion, I think in The Lies That Bind, that having sort of imperfect pictures to make sense of things, and that these pictures, by virtue of being imperfect, they're necessarily going to give us sort of responses. Through these pictures, we're going to make sense of the world in sort of in partial ways, and therefore the impetus should be to always be building on that. And related to that, I wanted to raise a question of around language. You mentioned how, according to, and this is around your discussion of the question of race, that Leibniz has, according to Leibniz, people were sort of distinguished in different classes or groups based on their language. So a question that comes to my mind, and you use the word color. It's fascinating. I love the alliteration: creed, country, color, class, culture, under which is the subtitle of The Lies That Bind: Rethinking Identity. Something that comes to mind as someone who's like, post-colonial subject, who's kind of really, for much of my life, I've tried to figure out, where do I belong? Who am I? These are sort of ongoing questions, which are, maybe they're ultimately not really fully answerable. But the question of language, as someone for whom English is, English, of course, my first, well, not necessarily, of course, but it is my first language. It's the language I'm most comfortable with. I think in English and dream in English, which is, I guess it says it all. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is, how does that fact, the fact that English is the lens through which I make sense of the world, with its sort of extensive body of literature and sort of philosophy and things like that, which is implicitly or explicitly coming through, how is that then predisposing me to view the world in a certain way, as opposed to, say, my parents, I was mentioning earlier before we started recording, they're originally from Bangladesh, like, say, they never moved here, and I only knew, I mean, everyone kind of knows English at this point, but that's, credit or discredit to the British, of course, but you see where I'm going with
yes.
that.
So I think,
and again, the question of power, sorry, forgive me for...
yes, I mean, on the one hand, again, it just seems undeniable that you're shaped by the language that you think in and speak mostly, or languages, as lots of people speak more than one. But that doesn't determine what you think. I mean, it just, it shapes the questions you can ask, but it doesn't fix the answers. And the most contentious debates in the history of the world are conducted in languages, not across languages. Right. The nature of Christ, is Christ human? Is Christ divine? Does he have two natures? If he has two natures, how are they related? That's all conducted in Greek and in Greek and then Latin, among people who were thinking in those languages. So on the other hand, because the available concepts shape the questions you can ask, other people who have concepts that you don't have can ask questions that you can't ask. And sometimes the answers will be of interest to you. And so you're going to have to learn their concepts. You're going to have to borrow concepts. People borrow concepts all the time. That shows up in the fact that in the rich vocabulary of English, there are lots and lots of loan words from other languages. Taboo is a word that came out of the Pacific into English. And it found great, it's an incredibly useful word. And we didn't have that word before, so we in English, so we couldn't talk about what we now talk about by talking about taboos and asking questions about taboos, and so on. There are lots of examples. So, so I think we shouldn't think that, on the one hand, we should accept that the languages we speak affect what we can think. On the other hand, we shouldn't think that they determine what we think. And our languages change. Gradually, over the course of time, important new concepts enter languages. Democracy, culture. The word for culture in my father's language is kocha, because we didn't have that word before. But now we do, and we use it to talk about things. And it was a good borrowing. It's a useful borrowing. But it's a problematic borrowing because the concept of culture is problematic, as all of these powerful and interesting concepts are. And so sometimes it's better to go back and use language that we had before and use that to question our newly acquired concept of kocha. So I think moving across languages and between languages enriches, obviously, your vocabulary. And because some languages have concepts that others don't, allows you to ask questions. But once you've seen the question, of course, you can bring it into your language. There's nothing to stop a concept from moving from one language to another. As I said, they do all the time. Well, race is a perfectly good example. The idea of race is sort of invented in Europe. Most people think starting with Spain and after the so-called reconquest of Spain, with the idea that there's something inside converts from Judaism and Islam that in their blood, that means they're not really Christians, that the new Christians, the so-called new Christians, are not really Christians. And the idea that there's something inside them turns into the idea that Jews are a race and so on. But now, that's an idea that is now spread everywhere. It seems as natural as anything that people talk about and think about races, and from my point of view, that's a mixed blessing, and that we might be better to be without the concept. Maybe we might be better if we didn't respond automatically to people in a racialized way, as we do in the United States and in England. And to some extent now everywhere, though it works slightly differently in different places. I mean, one interesting thing about South Asia is South Asians don't fit into the basic map that was developed in the 19th century, which was black, white, yellow, and then some sort of natives, American Indians, Aborigines, and so on. South Asians are Asians? Well, not really in the racial scheme, but they're not black, even though they're not white. But that doesn't mean that there aren't uses for the concept of race in India and in Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. There are, but they're shaped by the fact that South Asia is a little bit off the global map of the basic races. And that's in part for a simple reason, of course, which is that South Asians come in a great diversity of colors.
Right.
And since the European scheme was very, very focused on color, it had a hard time figuring out how to think about Indians, for example, people in the British India, the Raj, because some of them, had a long-standing theory that they were Aryans, and thought of themselves as therefore ancestrally related to the people of Western Europe, and others didn't. The Dravidians don't think that they're Aryan, never have, and so the way color works in South Asia is different from the way it works in some other places, and is connected, of course, with distinctive features of South Asia, which include caste and the distinctive sort of large language, the big language traditions, Sanskrit, Pali, and so on. So, but that's just an example of a concept which has sort of gone everywhere.
Yeah.
It does slightly different work in different places for reasons we've just been talking about, but it shows that a concept that wasn't there. Ghanaians, my ancestors 3 generations ago, just didn't have anything like the concept of race. I mean, they distinguished among peoples. They had lots of ideas about different kinds of people, but none of them mapped at all into the white, brown, yellow, red division of mankind. Partly because they didn't know many people from outside Africa. 5 generations back in my family, most people never saw someone from more than a few miles away, and if they did, they were probably people from a few miles away in West Africa. As I said, in my hometown, there have been houses for a couple of hundred years, and that's 1,000 miles away or more. But they weren't white. So in different places, these concepts sort of work in different ways, but they travel. And in this case, perhaps for worse rather than for better, but they do travel. And so if somebody has a good idea in a language, it may take a while to figure out how to move it from one language to another, but it can be done. And why do we know that? Because every child starts out not knowing any language.
and they babble all possible phonemes, don't they?
They try, and they get rewarded for producing the locally valuable phonemes. Right. And so they gradually shape their language into the sound system of whatever the languages or languages they hear. I mean, so we were raised between Tree and English, but I have nephews whose father is Norwegian, and they were raised between English and Norwegian, and they're fully fluent in both. And so if there's anything that can be said in Norwegian that can't be said in English, they can say it. And if they notice that it can't be said in English, they can think about how to explain to English people how to say it. And the same with Tree. I mean, in the Cosmopolitanism book, I introduce the idea in my father's language of a idea, which it roughly means a taboo, but it doesn't take very long to grasp the idea, even though most people don't have it if they're not from there. So I think languages are, as I say, on the one hand, they fix the questions you can ask, but they change, they're flexible. We can ask new questions because we develop new language. The history of science is among other things, the development of language. Again, in my father's language, in the dictionary for acid, it says proton tusso, proton donor, because we didn't really have the idea of an acid before. And so when they wanted a word for acid, they looked for the best theory of acids, and the best theory of acids was supposed to be that they were proton donors, and so they translated it as proton tusso. And a base is proton faco, take away a proton. So And that's a useful thing to have, a useful concept to have. Acids and bases are useful concepts for lots of purposes. So I think, so on the one hand, yes, language, but you also talked about not just language, but the kind of course, the treasury of writing that a language gives you access to is different in different.
And that we're sort of inevitably inheriting as well.
Yes,
so
yes.
You
inherit access
of it, right? Sorry.
Right.
Yeah.
But look, Caliban, Shakespeare's Caliban says, "You taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse." So people took British English in the colonies and used it to critique imperialism.
Right.
That English, the fact that it was English didn't stop.
Writes back, right?
Yes, exactly. That's the thesis of the Empire Writes Back, and it's obviously right that however powerful English is as a system, it didn't stop people rejecting British rule, and it didn't stop. Nor has it stopped people resisting American imperialism, using English to critique American imperialism, as well as Spanish and other relevant languages. So it's again, it's a matter of getting this right. On the one hand, yes, language shapes everything. On the other hand, we shouldn't think of this in a deterministic way, because we can change language, and we can struggle for new language, and then suddenly we can see new things. I mean, the ways we, sexual harassment is a good example, right? That's a new idea relatively. It was invented in my lifetime. Before, it was called, sometimes it was called flirting, right? Sometimes it was just called, you know,
being a guy,
being a guy, being a man, manliness, and so on. Seeing it through the lens of the concept of sexual harassment, suddenly lots and lots of things are immediately identifiable as things that people are doing and they shouldn't be doing, and they should never have been doing them. But until we had this concept, which comes with a theory about the proper relations between genders and about what is and isn't appropriate in the workplace, right? And now we have the notion of the microaggression, which annoys a lot of people. But it's genuinely revelatory to think about things in that way. You see things once you have that concept that you wouldn't have put them all together into one label. You might have recognized that they shouldn't have been going on. You know, a man comes to the office, slaps a secretary's behind. I think I would have recognized that it was something he shouldn't be doing without the concept of sexual harassment. But to see that along with his constant pestering her for dates and so on, see those as all part of the same thing, that requires conceptual innovation.
And the changes that happen, as you've been saying, and you also describe, these changes are sometimes gradual, sometimes sudden as well, but there's sort of an evolutionary almost sort of dimension to it.
Yes.
Not always, but very often.
And our understanding of sexual harassment has deepened. The concept was introduced very much in the context in the United States of legal developments. And people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg are very important in the history of this concept. But and a lot of feminist theorists as well as activists like Ginsburg, who was also a theorist, of course. But we have a deeper understanding of it as time goes on. I think, so Islamophobia, right? That's a really useful concept. But it needs exploration, development. We need to think about the range of things we want to put under that label. We want to notice that sometimes what's going on is more like old-fashioned racism and not like this phenomenon of Islamophobia and all that. So we deepen our understanding of these things, but just having the word helps us begin to think about them properly. So I think, and that's why people resist certain ways of talking, because a lot of the sort of debate about so-called wokeness is one lot of people saying, look, we've been acting and talking in a way that's that disrespects people, or that treats people without the dignity that they're due. And other people saying, oh, you're just making too much of a fuss about that, you know, or, you know, toughen your skin. Sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you, which is something that's could only be said by a person of great power and no imagination, because it's obvious that words can hurt you. Some words were designed to hurt people. That's what they're for. That's why the N word is. That's what it's there for. Its main function is to hurt people. It's got almost no other function. And there are similar words, you know, for women, which are just their only function, their only use is to harm, is to hurt. And so the people who either don't want to admit that they've been causing harm, or want to go on doing it, don't like it when you name what they're doing, and so they resist. Now, of course, again, this is a place where balance is important. What the right response is to the use of these terms, and whether you should, you know, de-platform people or silence them or send them to jail, those are different questions from the question whether it's bad. Not everything that's bad should be punished in the same way, and some things that are bad should be criticized but not punished. That's all up. That's all up for further debate. But that these words are harmful should not be up for debate, because that just shows you lack imagination if you don't think.
I think I remember coming across recently, so to some things you just said again, some article, I just saw the title sort of flash across my radar as I was scrolling, of course, something along the lines of someone considering why Shakespeare should be cancelled.
Oh, right, yes. Well, I mean,
this is where do we end? Like, let's just cancel all of white culture. You know?
Yes. Well, I think the trouble is, you know, whatever you want to say about Shakespeare, he puts the most beautiful language in The Tempest is in Caliban's mouth.
Yes.
The isle is full of noises, sounds and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. That's Caliban. That's the despised half-witch native boy. And he gives beautiful words to Shylock and to Othello. Words about resistance to homogenizing, demonizing, and so on. And I don't know, there are, in my fairly extensive reading experience, there aren't many places where someone does that as well as he does. So I would be loath to give him up just for that reason. Now, everybody before the present is terrible to some degree on gender questions, because we've had a revolutionary reimagining of gender, beginning with first wave feminism in the 19th century, which has, again, allowed us to see the awfulness of much of what was done in the past.
Yes.
Nevertheless, within that awful past, people, heterosexual couples, fell in love, adored one another, lived happy lives together, raised families, loved their daughters, gave them opportunities. I mean, so, you know, they lived within their context, but some of them did it better than others, and all of them made lives which were, many of which were extremely worthwhile, despite the awfulness of the gender system. And the same is true, you know, about race and everything else. And I think one difficulty of thinking about Shakespeare is that most people who are in the business of sort of this kind of criticism don't have a proper historical sense of what the context of Shakespeare's remarks are about things that are relevant to race and religion. And so they don't understand how profoundly reshaped ideas of race were after Shakespeare's time. I mean, Shakespeare doesn't use the word race in this sense at all. He uses the word race, but he doesn't use it to mean what we mean by it. So he doesn't, so neither, I mean, it is used, it's used to refer to Caliban by Miranda, I think. And it's used not by Shakespeare, but by Marlowe, a contemporary of Shakespeare's, in a play called The Jew of Malta, to refer to Jews. But it's clear in the context that it doesn't mean what we mean by it. And it just means, I mean, Barabbas, which is the name of the character in the Marlowe play, could just as well have said tribe, where he says race, and it wouldn't have any different meaning. And it just means a descent group. But that's not what race means. Race is a kind of descent group, but that isn't all that it means. And so if you're going to read, there's actually a wonderful essay by the Shakespearean scholar G.K. Hunter called Othello and Race Prejudice, which I commend to people who are trying to cancel Shakespeare. But you know, cancellation means that you won't do the hermeneutic work of trying to make sense of why it is that people are thinking the bad things that they're thinking. If we stop listening to, if Democrats in the United States stop listening to Republicans, and Republicans stop listening to Democrats, won't listen to them, we can't understand one another. And understanding is, as I've repeatedly said, not a matter of agreeing.
Right.
It's a matter of trying to figure out how your fellow citizens got to where they are. And you're not going to end up there. That's not a risk. You might end up closer to them, but I'm not going to end up thinking that Donald Trump was a great president, however many people I talk to. But I would
at least attempt to try to understand where they come. I mean, I like the sort of anthropologist's approach to sort of studying different cultures and sort of, you know, like really immersing oneself in a culture just to see how, and you reference anthropologists as well. Like, how do people think in different cultures? What does it mean to be a member of a sort of a far, you know, relative to me, a far-flung sort of land? And like, you know, where I remember there's one example I read many years ago. I think Houston Smith mentions this in one of his essays, that this must have been a while ago, that I'd be surprised if this is still true, but in some, again, one of these quote-unquote far-flung lands, an anthropologist from the West, presumably was most likely was trying to describe sugar to the people he was living with, studying, because they didn't have sugar. And he said it's something, the best that he could do was it tastes like milk. And I really grappled with that for the longest time. I was like, that doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. But anyway, but this is the nature of language. And
right. Well, there's a good example of something where the key thing about sugar is how it tastes. And if you want to explain to somebody what sugar is, probably the best thing is to give them some and let them taste it. And then you can say, things that taste like that we call sugar. And of course, there's a technical biochemist notion of sugar, which includes things that don't taste like that. But yeah, no, that you know, sometimes the way into another way of understanding is to do something with someone. You can say all you like about discussions of consciousness and meditation in sort of in Sanskritic traditions, but probably the first and best way in is to have someone teach you how to meditate?
Yeah, no, this
Just
is
to do it?
and this is something you talk about also, the difference between orthodoxy, which we know very well in a Western context, sort of correct belief or correct thought, perhaps could be sounded like that as well, versus the notion of orthopraxy, correct praxis. And so many of these traditions, the sort of non-Christian, non-Western traditions, as it were, are so much, which isn't to say that Christianity isn't, because of course Eastern Orthodoxy is very much about disciplinary practice, standing in prayer for 3 hours. My first ever experience at an Russian Orthodox service, I was like, oh my God, what have I got myself into? But then it was like, I almost,
Yeah.
through a process of just standing there, it suddenly started to make sense in a completely non-rational way. So the vital importance of praxis, and this is something that you bring up and discuss in important, powerful ways. I wanted to relatedly ask you actually the question around what's sometimes called bodily comportment in Bourdieu's language, as you use it, of course, bodily hexis.
Yes.
Pardon?
Yes, hexis.
Yeah, hexis. And I wanted to raise some questions going back to some of the earlier things that I sort of brought up around, the notion of being a coconut, and like how one sort of learns to be, just to be in the world, right? Through education, and you have an example of a student. You mentioned an example of a student who, in order, who's African American, in order to sort of prevent people from maybe calling out racial slurs, or no, to feel safe around him, he sort of hums some classical.
Yes, he whistles Vivaldi.
Right, which is fascinating, right? And,
yes.
and that made me wonder. Consciously or unconsciously, I'm sure I'm sort of a deep lover of music. I'm a musician myself. I'm sure I'm like humming different songs, definitely not Vivaldi, more sort of contemporary sort of music. And I wonder, at what point did I really become the coconut, right? I mean, this is like, it's somewhat of a tongue-in-cheek question, but like the very reality of this, the sort of structures we find in the gaze, which is real, and it's thankfully it's evolved in past, recent years, and say like England, for me, like presently is quite different from how it was even 10 years ago. But I'm not sure.
I would like to hear about that, because I haven't lived in England for a very long time, and I'm interested in what you.
I wonder also if it's partly also to do, my experience of England, I wonder if it's also partly to do with who I am today as well. Yes. I feel, I lived in New York for about 10 years, and I like to say that I really kind of discovered myself, to use that sort of language, as it were, while living in New York. I felt for the first time, maybe in a very, for the first time since I was of age, that I felt I could just be myself. I didn't have to be like conscious of my Muslimness, right? And I sometimes do come across as obviously Muslim, sometimes, and I'm also very complex. I'm not obviously Muslim in so many ways, and that's like, without going into so many details about that. But so I hope you see where I'm trying to get to with all this sort of rambling.
First of all, the point about hexis, the point about what Bourdieu calls hexis, is that you are inducted into a way of handling your body when you're inducted into a culture, and you're inducted into one way, and there are other ways. And so in societies which have different social groups living alongside with different ways of bodily comportment, people notice what your comportment is. There's, my friend Cornel West is recognizably African American in part because of the way he dresses and walks. He comes out of a tradition of bodily comportment, which is associated with African American priesthood, actually. And that's recognizable to anybody who knows, anything about that tradition. And, all of us have gender-based hexis. There are things that, I think I give the example in the book of the way in which Japanese women are sort of rewarded for covering their mouths when they're
laughing. Yes.
When they laugh, and that turns into something else when some Japanese gay men do it. It's a kind of hexis sign of a gender identification with women. They're not trans, but in that context, homosexuality is thought of as sort of feminizing. Right. So these are examples where the way you do things is shaped by not just by your culture, but by your identity within the culture. So that there are different forms of bodily comportment associated with different. And the most obvious of these for someone in England is it's something that Bourdieu talks a lot about in French, which is the comportment of the mouth, which produces different class accents.
Right.
And the Bourdieu has a wonderful and amusing discussion of the ways in which accent in French is classed, and he talks about it in terms of the comportment of the tongue, which in French is a pun, of course, because langue means both tongue and language, as it does sort of in English, tongue. So I think that's another thing that might be meant when people are policing the boundaries of identity is you've got the wrong hexis for your kind.
Yeah.
So when, again, when gay American men, some gay American men act in a way that's sort of usually called femme, there are politics within the gay male community about policing that, about whether that's, and there are people who think it's okay and people who think it's not, and of course that's true about straight people too. Straight people also have ideas about how gay people should behave, and about what's good and bad in forms of hexis associated with gayness. So these are places which are where we're shaped from very earliest days into, don't walk like that. Your grandmother says to the sissy boy. She might say it gently, but he's going to get the message that he's not supposed to do it, and if it seems natural to him, he's going to be conflicted about it, obviously. So we do this, telling girls not to wear trousers in places where girls are not supposed to wear trousers. That affects how you walk, or how you can walk. So that's going to affect your hexis. So I think these are central features of our identities that communicate our identities in multi-ethnic and multi-religious societies. Not just hexes, of course, but other things. I mean, if you wear a kippah, yarmulke if you're Jewish, or a crucifix, or the sort of beard that identifies you as a Muslim in some societies, well, everybody knows you're a Muslim or Jewish or a Christian. And they may do nothing with it, right? But it's just stored away in every encounter, the fact of your identity, your religious identity. And so on some occasions when something bad or good happens, it'll be in the box that you're whatever religion they have identified you as, and that'll be part of the memory that they take away. And unfortunately what happens is that when we have thoughts like that associated with identity, we tend to overgeneralize. Right. You have one bad, people say somebody's raped, a woman is raped by a person of some race. people say, well, it's natural that you should feel afraid of men of that race. But really? I mean, what's the inference from one person of this race is disposed to do this to most of them are, or all of them are, or many of them are? That's made explicit. That's an obviously invalid way of reasoning. But it's psychologically intelligible because the identity will have figured in the memory of the moment, of the event. And so it'll be part of the victim's picture of what's happened to her will be.
And of course, if there's like an entire body of discourse around it.
Well, yes.
Right, yeah.
Yes, which there usually is, unfortunately, about these things. And across societies, I mean, there are groups that are thought to be sort of sexually uncontained in every large society. And it's part of the stereotype, the negative stereotype of many groups is that. It was part of an anti-Semitic stereotype for a while. So these are the texture of identity. And, it's very hard, even knowing what we've just said, not to fall into these patterns.
It's very hard, yeah.
And so we have to discipline ourselves, I think. We have to remind ourselves all the time, yes. Look, this is just one X. And you should be very careful to generalize from this one X to all the others. And you can't hold the others responsible just because they share an identity for what this person has done. And you get the opposite problem. You get people of an identity who claim to speak for
everyone.
We Muslims, people say, or we gays, or we queer people.
And then very often you have, say, in the Muslim context, Muslims, not as an entire community, but many Muslims chanting, who gave you the right to speak?
Well, yes.
You don't represent us.
That's the right response, usually, I think. It's to say, you may speak as a Muslim, but you can't speak for Muslims without permission. I mean, if you get elected to the Islamic Council, then you can speak for Muslims because they've authorized you to speak for some particular Muslim community. So you can say, the Muslims of Bromley feel this because I'm the person they chose to speak for them. That's okay. But you can't speak for the Muslims of Bromley just because you happen to be a Muslim from Bromley. You've got to. So I think that's one of the difficulties of the sort of Azza talk, speaking Azza, is that it very easily turns into speaking for all the people that you say you speak as, and you can't do that in general. And usually, you can't do it at all. Because after all, to speak for Muslims would be to speak for Sunni and Shia and Ismaili and so on. And nobody can do that because they aren't all going to authorize you.
Right, of course. And then what very often happens is men speaking on women's behalf, which is terrible. Like, it's a terrible disaster. The number of shockingly embarrassing situations where this happens all the time, and I still cannot believe it. We have supposedly conferences set up where they're talking about gender rights, and there's not a single woman speaking representative. What world are you guys living in? It's ridiculous.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, again, there've been these huge changes in the way in which gender works everywhere. Not the same changes, but there've been huge changes everywhere. And so we're sort of struggling to figure out where we're going to end up with this everywhere. And people have ended up in different places within societies as well as across societies. The extent to which this is a big problem in my profession, because women are still, unlike in the rest of the humanities, where mostly women are now, in fact, in many in literary studies, they're in the majority among professors. But in philosophy, it's still very women are underrepresented. And So it's actually, and we have to think hard about why, because it's not anymore the simple old-fashioned kind of sexism. It's a more complicated story, and we have to change practices.
Yeah. What are some of your intuitions?
Well, I think one of the best pieces of work on this was done by actually a friend of mine, Sarah Jane Leslie, who's a philosopher and a dean at Princeton, but also a psychologist. I mean, she does psychological experiments with children. So she thinks that there's an interesting thing going on, which is that in early philosophy classes, philosophers, especially analytic philosophers, tend to communicate without actually saying that some of you will have a natural gift for this. It's a thing that some people have got, a philosophical mind. And and some of you won't, and that's fine. So you won't make it. And then you get your first grade, right? Well, if you've been told that some people have got it and some people haven't got it, if your first grade is a C, you think, oh, well, I haven't got it. And it turns out that there's some evidence that women, in a way, being more rational than men on average, think, okay, I haven't got it, so I'll do something else. Whereas the men are more likely to respond by saying, ha, you think I haven't got it? I'm going to try and prove that I have. And now, there's a very simple thing you can do about that, which is stop communicating that some people have got it and some people haven't got it, because it isn't true. Whether you're any good at philosophy mostly depends on whether you work at it and whether you're trained. If you're properly trained and you work hard, and you don't have any serious cognitive disabilities, you'll do fine. That's the truth. And most of the differences in performance in early college in philosophy have to do with earlier education, not to do with whether somebody's got some. I mean, I was incredibly lucky because I studied a lot of philosophy in high school, which most people in England don't. So of course I did very well in the exams when I started doing philosophy exams, because I'd just done more than most people. I wasn't cleverer than anybody else. I just had done more. I just knew more philosophy.
I have to confess that I'm really jealous of your upbringing. You have clearly really you're very blessed to have had some remarkable parents. Very loving.
They were, yes. The more, I mean, I hope most people think that their parents are remarkable, because succeeding to be just a sort of normally balanced human being requires some people who made it.
Sometimes it happens. Sometimes it happens despite one's parents.
Yes. No, there can be elements of that, but still, in general, we owe our parents a lot, I think. But yes, and I'd say, in my case, my family, I would say, because I learned a lot from my grandmothers. Well, strictly speaking, my Ghanaian step-grandmother and my English grandmother, as well. My English grandfather was dead when I was born, so I obviously didn't learn directly from him. And my Ghanaian grandfather was old and not very well, so I didn't see a lot of him when I was a child, even though he lived across the street. But I saw his wife, my step-grandmother, more or less every day as a child. Wow. And I learned huge amounts from her. So, and I think that I feel enormously grateful for what they did. But I should say, I mean, another thing that strikes me, has struck me increasingly over the years, is when I was young, I didn't appreciate quite how substantial the class privilege I was raised with.
Okay.
That's interesting. Racism. One reason racism wasn't a problem really for us, my sisters and I in England, was because of the sort of thing that after she died, my grandmother died, we found some letters she'd written. She kept her secretary kept copies of her letters to the schools that I went to. And my English grandmother sent these terrifying letters to these headmasters saying, if anything bad ever happens to my grandson on account of his color, you'll be hearing from me. And she was, she was Lady Cripps. And so she could sort of do things like that. And we never spent much time in cities in England. We spent times in the country, in villages. And in those villages, in basically mostly two villages, a place called Filkins and a place called Mitchenhampton. Filkins, my uncle, Sir John, had a big farm and owned a lot of the village. And in Mitchenhampton, where my grandmother lived, Lady Cripps, next door lived my aunt and uncle, Sir Robert and Lady Ricketts. And again, everybody in the village knew who we were because we were connected to Granny. So I mean, even if they'd wanted to try to harm us through race, it would have been very difficult. And I'm not saying they did. I have no evidence that anybody did want to do that. But my point is that that protection, the class protection, is something that, you just take it so much for granted. It's just, you have all these privileges. I very much understand white privilege, actually, because of this, in a way that I wouldn't, I think, if I had a working class or even more regular middle class background. I understand what it is just to take it for granted that people will treat you properly, and to be therefore puzzled rather than upset when they don't, to be thinking, well, why does this person think they can treat me? They made a mistake, clearly. I mean, I haven't mentioned that my uncle and great uncle were kings in Ghana. So, yes. So I was, one thing everybody knew when you walked down the street was that when I was a kid, it was that my uncle was, the great uncle was the king, and then later that my uncle was king. And I don't mean everybody, but I mean, this was their capital. So most people knew a lot about their families, and they knew my aunt, who was married to the king, and my great aunt, who was married to the king before. So it would have been astonishing if I hadn't had a successful life, given the enormous privilege into which I was.
Well, it's a blessing. It's a blessing.
Yes. And we were raised by my mother and grandmother in particular to think that because of this we had obligations. That the only possible justification for these enormous privileges was if you did something with them for somebody. And none of my sisters lives in Ghana now, but my two elder sisters anyway, especially, are active in doing things in the places that they live, which are Nigeria and Namibia, as it happens. But so my sister just told me that I had to support a Namibian kid through next year. Sent me the bill. And she's organizing this. She's always writing to friends around the world to make sure these Namibian kids can get a good education. So anyway, so I think that's one of the reasons why I wrote the chapter on class in the book, was to sort of make it clear that so many of the assumptions about success in our society ignore the fact that a huge component of success for many, many people is just a certain kind of set of privileges, of educational privileges, social status privileges, and social capital privileges, which mean that you have connections. I mean, when my sister finished her undergraduate degree at Sussex, she went to the office for helping people get jobs. And she said they told her, well, do you have any connections? They said that was their career advice was, well, do you have any connections, any strings you can pull?
Oh, wow.
And that was realistic, of course, in a way. It was terrible, but it was realistic because in many, many areas of life, pulling strings is how you get certain advantages.
And your discussion around this concept of meritocracy is I mean, we problematize it, and would you mind saying a little more about?
Yeah. So I'm just really
itself. Yeah.
making points that were made by Michael Young, who invented the word meritocracy in a book that was very critical of it, but that part of it got forgotten. So he has 2 points about meritocracy. One is that it's incredibly hard to stop people trying to give illegitimate advantages to their own children. Now, of course, we should love our own children and do what we can for them, but there are things we shouldn't do. And his point is, it's hard to stop people doing those things. So, you know, you do everything you can to get your kid into a good school. But in doing that, you take advantage of resources that other parents don't have. That's unfair. What you should be doing is trying to make sure that your kids get into a good school, because every kid's getting into a good school because we've got good schools. Well, that's very demanding. And so people don't do that. And so they end up getting advantages for their children. If they have advantages themselves, they transmit them. And so you get the intergenerational transmission of advantage. And that's basically what class is about. So if you, so in a meritocracy, if you claim to be responding to talent and effort, you should not be responding to the connections of the parents. And so you should try to screen those out. But what we call a meritocracy doesn't screen those out at all. In fact, it accelerates them. Meritocracy now in the North Atlantic context means giving prizes to people who do well on certain tests. But doing well on those tests is something that parents can help you achieve by giving you, and it doesn't matter what the system is. In England, it's a very exam-based system, but in America, it's not. It's an exam-based system. Plus, you have to have been in to get into the best colleges. You have to have been in the junior UN, and you have to have played sports and so on. So the kids of advantaged people all are in the UN and junior UN, and they play sports, preferably sports that can get you into college but aren't played much in other schools, because that gives you an even further leg up, which is why a lot of people play lacrosse, which is basically a private school game in the United States. Anyway, so that's one problem. The problem is that it's not meritocracy. If by meritocracy you mean that you're rewarding this person's efforts, you're mostly, to a significant extent, rewarding their efforts plus the efforts of other people. And if you think that's unfair, then you can't call it meritocracy. But because we do call it meritocracy, it has a further consequence, which is the people who are successful think that they're successful because of something they did. Right. And so they do not have the feeling that I have, which is I'm successful because of things lots of people did, and so I owe something back. And so modern meritocrats tend to be indifferent to the conditions of everybody else, because they say, well, they had the same shot as I do, but they didn't have the same shot as you did, mostly. And so it's just false that to say that. So that's one set of problems. Second set of problems, which again, he identified at the start. If you have massive differentials in status and rewards, even if they were meritocratically assigned, you're going to get a kind of class society. It won't be a class society in which class is transmitted across the generations, but there still will be big class differences. And it's very hard in those circumstances for the people at the bottom, especially if they're being told that they had the same chance as everybody else, so being at the bottom is on them. It's very hard for them to end up with self-respect. And it's a condition of a dignified human existence that you have self-respect. That's a really hard problem. The first problem you can solve, right? You can make all the schools great, or you can have affirmative action for people whose schooling has been less good. Yes, you can do something about that. You can equalize that. Yes. But if you have massive differences in status and income, and you're telling the story according to which that's all fair, then of course the people at the bottom are going to have a bad opinion of themselves. Well, in our current society, it's not fair. So they don't have that reason for not thinking well of themselves. Only if you're in the bottom 10% of the British population, your kids have a 1% chance of going to college. Whatever you think about the talent of the bottom 10%, it can't be the case that only 1% of their children could profit from a college education. So they shouldn't feel bad about themselves. They should be angry at the rest of us for having produced a society in which that's true. But suppose we did achieve that. Suppose the chances were, equal for everybody, given whatever talents you had. The notion of talent is one we should interrogate too, but I'll put that aside. You don't want a society in which people are looking down on themselves, do you? I mean, systematically, you just don't want that. So how do you change the attitude to success?
Yes.
To say to the people who haven't been super successful, but you matter, and your lives matter. And furthermore, there are successes in your life, right? They don't map into the big social rewards, but you have made a human life. And you've made your life, that is, you've made a life with your talents, your resources, your circumstances, and your choices. And that life is an achievement. And it doesn't, because the resources that went into making that life are unique to you, you cannot compare yourself to anybody else.
Yes.
You can only compare yourself to someone you could have been. You could have been. And my favorite version of a story making this point is actually due to an 18th century rabbi called Rabbi Zusha, who said, when I get to heaven and they ask me why I should be let in, they'll say, if they say, why weren't you Moses? I'll say, but I didn't have Moses's gifts. And they say, why? Well, then why weren't you at least David? And you'll say, but I didn't have David's gifts either. And then Rabbi Jusser said, but if they ask me why you weren't Zusha, I will have nothing to say.
Oh, wow.
So everybody has a unique thing to be doing, and you have to do it, to the best of your ability. And trying to make a world in which that's the achievement, right? Making your life, not making a life that's better than his or ranked 37 in Bromley or whatever, making a life that's your life and it's a good life for you, by your standards, by standards that you yourself have developed and inherited as well, and so on. That I think is a big challenge, because right now we don't, and it's going to be a bigger challenge, because as work changes and as there's perhaps less and less really high paid work, because machines and artificial intelligence are doing all the difficult things, there's going to be fewer and fewer people who are successful by that other metric. And then we'll have unless we change our attitudes on this question, we'll have a massively depressed population.
It'll be disaster, yeah.
So this is something I'm thinking about right now. I think it's getting this right, this problem that Michael Young identified all those years ago, of how do you get away from the differences in, you can't stop differences in honor, because there's a legitimate kind of honor, right? I should honor Gandhi. Gandhi has astonishing achievements. It would be weird to say, oh, well, he's just another human being. He's not just another human being. He's an amazing human being. He and Martin Luther King Jr. and so on. They're amazing people. It's ridiculous to deny honor to Vanessa Williams. She's a great, is her name Vanessa? The tennis player.
Tennis player Vanessa Williams, yes.
Yeah, I mean, she and Serena are just way better at that than almost anybody. So we should. It's perfectly legitimate to honor.
Vanessa or Venus? Sorry, I'm confused myself.
Yes, so it's Venus, right? Venus and Serena. They're entitled to respect.
Should we respect? Not to get too political, but maybe to get a little political. Should we respect Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates and these tech oligarchs. I mean, this is something I think a lot about. And
yes.
maybe,
I think we grant too much respect to money. If we want to respect Zuckerberg for something, let's respect him for having created a powerful new medium for human interaction. And then let's ask him to be responsible in the development of it so that it doesn't become an instrument for doing harm. If I respect, to the extent that I respect Bill Gates, it's not because he's a billionaire, it's because he started the Gates Foundation, and they are probably going to help us eradicate malaria. And that seems like something worth doing. And he's played a very big part in making it happen by spending money on it. So I think the mere fact of being successful in business is business people. The psychology of successful business people depends in part upon their thinking that they did it.
Yeah.
But they didn't. And,
Right.
and they may go on believing whatever they like, but we have to.
As the son of, nothing like Bill Gates or Zuckerberg, of course, but as the son of a, fairly successful businessman, I know that firsthand.
Yes.
I did it all. It's because,
Yes.
none of you played any role whatsoever. It's, whoops, sorry.
And
it's a weird sort of narcissistic mentality almost.
Yeah. And
I'm not saying that my father's necessarily, I mean, I'm not commenting on that per se.
No.
I wonder if narcissists actually get far in the world of.
I think there are certain kinds of activities in which that's rewarded, and it may be that certain kinds of business are among them. But the fact is that there's always a luck element in these, in business success. It was wise of Bill Gates not to sell the copyright, the patent and copyright for MS-DOS to IBM. It was wise, but he can't possibly have known in advance the difference that would make. Right. And so on. So there's always an element of luck in all these things, and also there's just a huge social input. If the United States government through DARPA hadn't spent all that money on developing the internet, there wouldn't have been a business for Zuckerberg to develop. There wouldn't have been the infrastructure. That was all public investment. And not just public investment in the infrastructure, of course, but public investment in education and in research to produce modern computer science, which is also the result of the work of many, many people, funded by everybody, funded through taxes. So in that sense, you can't think of a modern business. A modern business has to sell. If it sells goods, they have to travel on roads. The roads are built by and for all of us. The postal service that Amazon uses is a public service. So mobilizing it is in the way that they have is terrific, but you can't say that you did it, because without the post office, you couldn't have done it. The post office and UPS and all these other distribution services.
I love I really appreciate the Buddhist sort of attitude. And not just, I mean, it's like very sort of something that they seek to inculcate, existentially within themselves through practice, as bodily practice. The idea that we're all fundamentally interconnected, and this really, I think, speaks also to your work and your thinking, that to say that we're these sort of splendid, these islands unto ourselves and living in splendid isolation is a complete myth, and my slight addition would be that it's a narcissistic attitude. Ultimately,
it is a narcissistic attitude, and it is part of the package of a kind of individualism, which is also something that I think, as a philosophical matter, needs to be criticized. We're only, there's a thing that a formula that the proponents of what in Southern Africa is called Ubuntu say. They say, I am because we are. And I think that's absolutely right. And the we is not just villages and families, though it is villages and families very importantly. It's all of it. So here's just a simple example. My mother and I didn't like writing letters to my parents when I was a child. It reminded me that I wasn't with them when I was in boarding school.
Yes, yeah.
But of course, all English boarding schools require you to write to your parents once a week. So I had to. And you were put in the classroom with a piece of paper and a pen and told to write a letter to your parents. So my mother and I settled into a pattern, which was that we sent each other poems. I wrote poems for my mother and she wrote poems for me.
Beautiful.
Many of my mother's poems were haiku because she loved, in translation, she didn't know Japanese, in translation, she loved Basho and the narrow road to the deep north and the poems in there. And we were raised to know about them and love them. So without this 17th century Buddhist Japanese Zen monk, I wouldn't have been able to communicate with my mother as a child from England to Ghana in the way that we were able to do, right? So what I am, and which in everybody's life is in part a result of their relationship with their parents, what I am is a result of something that Basho did in the 17th century. So not only far away, but long ago. And again, my father survived as a political prisoner in part because he had Shakespeare with him. He had the complete works of Shakespeare, which he got because he asked for them and they told him he couldn't have them because they said Shakespeare was a British subversive and they weren't going to have him reading British subversives. So he went to the prison doctor and said, would you write me a prescription for the complete works of Shakespeare for my mental health? And the prison doctor said, okay. So my father got Shakespeare on prescription, but it was one of the things that got him through. So this Elizabethan Englishman got this Ghanaian imprisoned politician through a period of imprisonment. So I just think, it isn't just families, it isn't just lovers and friends. The thing about our species, right, is, and language is the heart of this, we are building on materials provided by everybody, including Aristotle, who's died quite a long time ago, and whoever wrote Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, whoever wrote the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, as the Jews call it, and so on. We can draw on that through translation in the case of much of it, because there are so many human languages, but still we can draw on it, build on it. And so we're connected in that way, symbolically, semiotically, we're all in a network. But of course, in the modern world, we're also, and this has been true for a very long time, since at least the Roman Empire, we're all economically connected, right? When Mansa Musa, the Emperor of Mali, made his pilgrimage to Mecca, he took so much gold with him that he caused inflation in the Eastern Mediterranean. So people working down the mines in Mali were, and in other parts of West Africa, so they didn't get all their gold from home, were part of the story of the development of the economies of what are now Greece and Turkey, and Palestine and Israel and so on in the 15th century. So, and it's even more obvious now, that you have some stupid idiots make a bunch of mistakes in the American mortgage market, and we have a great world depression. And then finally, we are ecologically interconnected.
Yes.
Right. So we're symbolically interconnected, we're economically interconnected, and we're obviously ecologically. I mean, the pandemic is just the most recent reminder of that. That virus started the other side of the world from where I am. But the reason I'm sitting in this house and not going out is because of that virus. And fortunately, I'm vaccinated. And the reason I'm vaccinated is because the Chinese sequenced the virus within a week or two and sent the sequence to the WHO, and the WHO sent it to everybody. And so people were able to get to work around the world immediately in a rush to use the best science we have to develop both treatments and which turned out not to be so easy, but vaccines, which turned out to be possible to do relatively swiftly. That, without that very complex international scientific, biological, medical network, we'd all be screwed. We'd all be way worse. I mean, it's been bad enough. It's been terrible. Millions of people have died, but it would have been tens of millions. So yes, the idea that, Mark Zuckerberg can't stop that with all his billions. And so we need to bear that in mind. And we need, I think, as I say, we should honor the things worth honoring. Yes. I think being a billionaire is probably enough reward in itself. We don't need to pile on with great deference and honoring. That's fine. The money is the reward there. But if you care about things, if you care about tennis, you care about Venus Williams. If you care about poetry, you care about Seamus Heaney and Basho, and you honor them because they're better at it than almost anybody. So there's nothing wrong with that. What was wrong with the old system of honor was that you got honor just by being born into the right place. If you came out of the womb of a duchess, you got honor. And if you didn't, you didn't. But that's not any kind of achievement. That's not something that should be rewarded or honored. It's just, it's a piece of very good fortune. It should be reward enough.
and in your, Professor, in all sincerity, in your sort of lived example, I think you really embody, you embody everything you teach, and certainly you're highly honored and should be even more widely known, because you have taken the responsibility of what happened to be just the circumstances of your birth. It's not something you chose. It's just fate chose it for you. But you've really sought and you seek to help people. And I think this is the best that we can do in all circumstances, no matter where we're coming from, no matter what our contexts. The sort of the line from one of the old Spider-Man movies, right? With great power comes great responsibility.
Yes.
Right? It's and maybe that is the key, right? If instead of sort of to use every modern day contemporary parlance, instead of hating on people for maybe a situation they didn't necessarily choose for themselves, let's see if they're actually going out of their way, because it does require going out of one's way and one's comfort zone and one's sort of whatever sort of context one might be in, say comfortable and so forth, to actually help people. That requires sacrifice, that requires humility, that requires giving time and energy, and these are, I think,
That's true. Though I think it's also enormously rewarding. So you get you give, but you get. I think my mother very much taught me that. I mean, she was very active in all kinds of things, old people's homes, orphanages, and all that kind of thing. But you could just see that she had a great time with the old people in the old people's home who were being very.
They study everything. I mean, I don't know who the they is in this, but the sort of archetypal they, and they found out that they figured out that in an American context, I think it's for like I forget what the number of family members are in this particular example, but let's say 4. That after a certain sort of income bracket, like I think it's like $70,000. That the happiness stops sort of going up on the graph, it just sort of plateaus. And the only time when the happiness does increase is when people help other people. So this is
yes. So we're programmed for sociability.
Yeah.
We're made to be sociable. And we just have to you just have to bring children up with a recognition of that. I like the sort of Friday donation custom in Islam, because it just, you grow up thinking, if I have more than these other people, I should share some of it.
And I believe, I really see, because I'm a deep lover of all the religious traditions, charity is fundamental to the religious life.
Yes.
And I'm kind of biased because I come from, say, like a theological background and so forth. But I think we can't do better than that. Like any sort of, I haven't seen it happen yet, at least, sort of improving on these sort of different religious traditional, and they have their unique ways of expressing it.
Yes.
But and I don't think it's accidental at all that charity is such an integral part of
right. And it's really it's also there in, like, it's there in Confucianism, in the idea of ren, of benevolence. I mean, they really also have this notion that you owe goodwill to everybody. Owe goodwill. It's not just a good thing.
That's so beautiful, yeah.
It's sort of, as it were, the minimum demand we make of you, that you have goodwill towards, as in the New Testament says, goodwill towards mankind, to all men. And that idea of charity, what the Old Testament calls in English loving kindness, which I think is chesed in Hebrew. These ideas are, they're part of, they're developed over long ages as ways of ordering society, and we, none of us lives up to them successfully. Well, maybe occasionally people do, but most of us don't live up to them. But striving for them, or aiming at them, or even sort of getting halfway there or a quarter way there, makes the world a better place.